The summer heat pressed down on Fort Braxton like a heavy blanket as Captain Maria Sullivan stepped off the transport bus. Her combat boots hit the pavement with a familiar thud, and she adjusted the duffel bag on her shoulder. After 18 months overseas, the North Carolina air should have felt like a welcome embrace. Instead, it felt thick with something she couldn't quite name. Maria was 42 years old, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the creases of a long journey home. But it was the small patch on her right shoulder that told her real story, a silver dagger crossed with lightning bolts. To most people, it was just another military decoration. To those who knew, it meant she had served with the most elite special operations unit in the armed forces. She made her way toward the administrative building, her boots echoing in the quiet afternoon. The base was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had just grown used to the vast emptiness of the desert. Here, neat rows of buildings stood against a backdrop of pine trees, and the sound of training exercises drifted across the parade grounds. Inside the building, the air conditioning provided immediate relief. A young private sat at the reception desk, barely looking up from his computer screen. When Maria approached, he glanced at her with the kind of casual disinterest reserved for routine paperwork. "Help you?" he asked, his tone flat. "Captain Sullivan reporting for reassignment." The private's eyes flickered to her uniform, but they didn't linger on the shoulder patch. He tapped something into his computer and slid a clipboard across the desk. "Fill this out. Have a seat over there." Maria took the clipboard and settled into one of the plastic chairs that lined the wall. Across from her, two male officers sat in conversation, their voices low but audible. One was a major, the other a captain like herself. They wore their authority like expensive cologne, obvious and overdone. "Did you see the roster for the new training program?" the major said, shaking his head. "They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days." The other captain chuckled. "Tell me about it. I heard they're assigning women to combat leadership roles now. Like that's going to work out." Maria kept her eyes on the paperwork, her jaw tightening slightly. She had heard variations of this conversation 100 times before. It never got easier, but she had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting with words. "I give it 6 months before she washes out," the major continued. "These diversity promotions never last. She'll be crying in some office job before winter. If she makes it that long," the captain added with a smirk. Maria signed the last form and stood, walking past the two men to return the clipboard. Neither of them acknowledged her presence. The private took her paperwork without comment and handed her a folder. "You're assigned to Barrack C, 2nd floor. Training schedule starts Monday at 0600. You'll be working under Colonel Hayes in the Advanced Tactics Division." Maria nodded and took the folder. As she turned to leave, she caught the major watching her with barely concealed amusement. He nudged his companion and whispered something that made them both laugh. The sound followed her out the door like smoke. The walk to the barracks gave her time to think. She had known this wouldn't be easy. Fort Braxton had a reputation old guard, traditional, resistant to change. They tolerated women in support roles, even accepted them in standard combat positions now the policy demanded it. But leadership? Command? That was still a man's world, and they guarded it fiercely. Her quarters were sparse but functional. A narrow bed, a metal locker, a small desk beneath a window that overlooked the training grounds. Maria unpacked methodically, hanging her uniforms with precision, arranging her personal items in the locker. Among them was a photograph herself with 6 other soldiers, all in desert camouflage, standing in front of a helicopter. 5 men, 2 women, all wearing the same silver dagger patch. Only 3 of them had made it home. She placed the photo on the desk and sat down, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time since she'd arrived. This assignment was supposed to be a reward, a recognition of her service, a chance to share her hard-won knowledge with the next generation of soldiers. But already she could feel the resistance, the invisible walls going up around her. Outside her window, soldiers ran drills in the fading sunlight. Their cadence calls drifted up to her room, a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. Maria watched them for a long moment, then stood and began preparing her uniform for Monday. She had faced enemy fire, survived impossible odds, and lost friends to the chaos of war. She wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded officers drive her away from where she belonged. But as the sun set over Fort Braxton, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that her hardest battle was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the sharp blast of reveille at 5:30. Maria was already awake, had been for an hour, unable to shake the nervous energy that hummed through her veins. She dressed carefully, ensuring every crease was perfect, every button aligned. Her boots gleamed like black mirrors. The Advanced Tactics Division occupied a building on the far side of the base, a converted warehouse that now housed classrooms, simulation rooms, and a small auditorium. Maria arrived 15 minutes early, clutching her assignment folder and a notebook. The hallway was empty, except for a maintenance worker mopping the floor. She found the main classroom and stepped inside. 25 chairs faced a raised platform with a podium and a large screen. Maps covered one wall, and a weapons cabinet stood locked in the corner. Everything smelled of floor polish and old coffee. The door opened behind her, and Maria turned to see a group of officers filing in. They were younger than her, mostly fresh-faced captains and first lieutenants eager to advance their careers. They chatted easily with each other, the comfortable camaraderie of men who had trained together, deployed together, drunk together. When they noticed Maria, the conversation died like someone had flipped a switch. "Morning," Maria said, her voice steady and professional. A few of them nodded. Most just stared. One lieutenant, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jawline that looked carved from granite, let his gaze travel from her boots to her face with deliberate slowness. His name tag read Morrison. "You lost?" Morrison asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I don't think so. This is Advanced Tactics, room 114. "It is," Morrison crossed his arms. "But this is the leadership track. Administrative offices are in Building 3. Maria felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm assigned to this program. Captain Maria Sullivan." The name meant nothing to them. Why would it? Her operations had been classified, her unit's existence barely acknowledged. The Silver Dagger patch on her shoulder might as well have been invisible. "Sullivan," another officer repeated, checking a tablet. "Yeah, she's on the roster. Guess they're really doing this diversity thing." Morrison snorted. "Right. Just what we need, someone who checked the box to get here." Maria opened her mouth to respond, but the door swung open again, and everyone snapped to attention. Colonel Richard Hayes entered the room like a weather front, imposing, unavoidable, charged with authority. He was in his late 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that suggested he had forgotten how to smile sometime in the last decade. "At ease," Hayes said, moving to the podium. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Maria before moving on. "Welcome to Advanced Tactics. You're here because someone thinks you have potential. My job is to determine if they're right or if they're fools." He opened a folder and began calling names, assigning seats. When he reached Maria's name, he paused, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Captain Sullivan." Front row center. Maria moved to the assigned seat, aware of every eye on her back. She sat down and opened her notebook, pen ready, ignoring the whispers that rippled through the room. Hayes launched into his opening lecture, outlining the program's structure and expectations. It was rigorous, demanding, designed to push officers to their limits. They would study strategy, leadership under fire, crisis decision-making. They would run simulations, lead mock operations, be evaluated on every choice they made. This program has a 60% dropout rate, Hayes said, his voice hard as concrete. Most of you will not finish. And that's fine. Better to discover your limitations here than in the field where lives depend on you. The morning session covered the basics of tactical assessment. Hayes presented scenarios on the screen, asking officers to identify problems and propose solutions. He called on people randomly, his questions sharp and probing. When an officer fumbled an answer, Hayes didn't soften the blow. Maria waited for her turn, her mind working through each scenario as it appeared. She had lived these situations, not in a classroom, but in the dust and chaos of real combat. She knew the answers not from books, but from experience written in scars and memories. But Hayes didn't call on her. Not one stop by lunch. The pattern was clear. 25 officers in the room, and Hayes had questioned 24 of them. Only Maria remained untouched, invisible in the front row. The other officers noticed. She could feel their satisfaction, their vindication. See, she doesn't belong here. Even the colonel knows it. The afternoon session focused on leadership styles. Hayes displayed famous military commanders throughout history, analyzing their decisions, their successes and failures. He paced the front of the room like a caged animal, his energy demanding attention. Leadership isn't about being liked, Hayes said. It's about making the hard choices when everyone else freezes. It's about taking responsibility when things go wrong and giving credit when things go right. It's about earning respect through action, not demanding it through rank. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Maria for the first time since the morning. Captain Sullivan, give me an example of poor leadership. The room went silent. Maria felt 24 pairs of eyes lock onto her, waiting for her to stumble, to prove she didn't belong. She stood, her voice clear and measured. A leader who makes decisions based on assumptions rather than intelligence. Who puts soldiers in danger because he's too proud to admit he doesn't have all the answers. Specific example? Maria hesitated for only a heartbeat. Operation Crimson Dawn, 2022. A commander ordered a raid on a suspected weapons cache based on outdated intelligence. He ignored warnings from his reconnaissance team that the situation had changed. 12 soldiers were killed in the ambush that followed. The weapons cache had been moved 2 weeks earlier. The room remained silent. Hayes studied her for a long moment. You speak like someone who was there. I was, sir. I was on that reconnaissance team. Something flickered in Hayes's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or respect. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Sit down, Captain. Maria sat, her heart pounding. She had revealed more than she intended, opened a door she usually kept locked. But she was tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed. The rest of the day passed without incident. When Hayes finally dismissed them at 1700 hours, Maria gathered her things and headed for the door. Behind her, she heard Morrison's voice, pitched just loud enough for her to hear. Bet she read about that operation in some report. Probably never left a desk. Laughter followed her into the hallway. Maria kept walking, her spine straight, her head high. Let them laugh. Let them doubt. She had survived worse than mockery. But as she walked back to her barracks in the cooling evening air, she couldn't shake the feeling that Colonel Hayes knew something. That brief flicker in his eyes when she mentioned Operation Crimson Dawn. It hadn't been just surprise, it had been recognition. The weeks that followed established a brutal routine. Every morning at 6, Maria reported to the Advanced Tactics classroom. Every day, Colonel Hayes pushed the officers harder, demanding more, accepting nothing less than excellence. And every day, Maria felt the walls closing in. The other officers had formed their alliances, their unspoken brotherhood that excluded her completely. They worked in teams during exercises, deliberately arranging themselves so Maria was always the odd one out. During breaks, they huddled in groups, their conversations stopping whenever she approached. In the cafeteria, chairs became mysteriously occupied. When she looked for a place to sit, Morrison had emerged as the unofficial leader of her tormentors. He was skilled. Maria had to admit top of the class in tactical assessment, natural charisma that made other officers gravitate toward him. But he wielded that influence like a weapon, and Maria was his favorite target. "Think fast, Sullivan," he called one afternoon during a field exercise. He tossed a training grenade toward her without warning. Maria caught it reflexively, her muscle memory from countless combat situations taking over. She neutralized it and returned it to the equipment box without breaking stride. Morrison's smile faltered for just a moment. "Lucky catch." "Wasn't luck," Maria said quietly and kept walking, but the incidents escalated. Equipment went missing from her locker. Training schedules appeared with the wrong times, making her late for formations. During a night navigation exercise, someone switched her compass, sending her miles off course. She completed the exercise anyway, using the stars to find her way back, arriving exhausted but on time. Through it all, Colonel Hayes watched with those unreadable eyes. He still rarely called on her during lectures, but Maria noticed something. Whenever she did answer a question, he listened differently than he did to the others. His attention sharpened, his focus intensified, as if he was looking for something specific. The breaking point came on a Friday in late September. The class was running an urban combat simulation in the warehouse's mock city, a maze of plywood buildings and narrow streets designed to replicate the chaos of real urban warfare. They were divided into teams of 5, assigned objectives, and evaluated on their performance. Maria was paired with Morrison and 3 other officers. She could see the satisfaction in Morrison's eyes when the assignments were announced. He was team leader, which meant he controlled how the exercise played out. The objective was simple: secure a building, extract a high-value target, neutralize any threats. Standard operation that Maria had performed dozens of times in actual combat. But from the moment the simulation began, Morrison ignored every suggestion she made. "We should check that alley," Maria said, pointing to a side street that offered concealment. "The main road is too exposed." "We're going straight through," Morrison said. "Speed matters more than caution in this scenario. Not if speed gets your team killed." Morrison turned to face her, his jaw tight. "I'm team leader, Sullivan. You follow orders. That's how this works." They took the main road. 50 yards in, simulated gunfire erupted from the windows above them. Training rounds, paint-filled projectiles that hurt like hell when they connected, rained down on the team. 2 officers were marked as casualties within seconds. "Fall back," Morrison shouted, his earlier confidence evaporating. "No," Maria said, already moving. She sprinted toward a doorway, using the building's overhang for cover. "Morrison, lay down suppressing fire on that 3rd-floor window." "Jenkins, with me." But Morrison hesitated, pride warring with panic. In that moment of indecision, Maria made the choice for him. She pulled a flashbang from her gear and tossed it through the 1st-floor window. The simulated explosion gave her the second she needed. She breached the door, moving through the building with the fluid precision of someone who had done this when the bullets were real. She cleared 3 rooms, neutralized 4 enemy combatants, and reached the high-value target in under 2 minutes. By the time Morrison and the others entered the building, the exercise was over. The evaluation room afterward was tense. Colonel Hayes stood at the front, reviewing the footage from the cameras positioned throughout the simulation. The other officers sat in silence, watching Maria with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to outright hostility. Hayes paused the footage on a frame showing Maria breaching the door. "Captain Sullivan, explain your decision to disobey your team leader's order." Maria stood, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. Captain Morrison froze. In a real situation, that hesitation would have cost lives. "I made a tactical judgment call based on the situation. You broke the chain of command. I completed the mission." Hayes studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Morrison. "Captain Morrison, your assessment?" Morrison's face was red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Maria couldn't tell. "Sullivan is a liability. She's reckless, insubordinate, and doesn't understand how a team functions. She has no business in this program. Is that right?" Hayes pressed a button and a new video appeared on the screen. Because the data tells a different story. Sullivan's approach reduced casualty estimates by 75%. Her breach was textbook. Her room clearing was faster and more efficient than any other officer in this class has demonstrated. The room went very quiet. Hayes turned back to Maria. "Where did you learn to move like that, Captain?" Maria felt the weight of the question, understood what he was really asking. "Overseas, sir. In situations where textbook wasn't good enough." "What unit?" This was at the moment of truth. Maria could continue hiding behind classified operations and need-to-know clearances. Or she could trust that Hayes already knew the answer and was simply waiting for confirmation. "Task Force Silver Dagger, sir. Special Operations Group." The reaction was immediate. Morrison's mouth fell open. Several other officers leaned forward, suddenly seeing Maria in an entirely different light. Silver Dagger was legendary elite operators who handled the missions nobody else could. They worked in the shadows, their successes never publicized, their failures never acknowledged. Hayes nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he'd suspected all along. 18 months deployed?" "Yes, sir." "Combat actions?" 37 operations. "Mixed results." "Mixed results," Hayes repeated, a hint of something almost like approval in his voice. "That's one way to describe it." He turned to address the class. "The Silver Dagger patch Captain Sullivan wears isn't just decoration. It's earned through operations most of you can't imagine and wouldn't survive. It means she's done more before breakfast than most officers do in their entire careers." Morrison looked like he'd been slapped. The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hayes continued, his voice hard. "I knew who Captain Sullivan was the moment she walked into this classroom. I also knew that not one of you bothered to look beyond her gender to see what she actually brings to this program. You assumed weakness where there is strength. You saw an obstacle where there is an asset. And that kind of blindness will get soldiers killed." He let that sink in, then dismissed the class. As the officers filed out, several of them glanced at Maria with new respect. Morrison avoided her eyes entirely. Maria gathered her things slowly, processing what had just happened. Hayes had known all along. He'd watched her be excluded, mocked, undermined, and he'd said nothing. The realization stung more than she expected. "Captain Sullivan," Hayes called as she reached the door. "A word." She turned back. The room was empty now except for the two of them. Hayes pulled a file from his desk and held it up. It was thick, marked with security classifications and official seals. "I've been reading about you," he said. "Your record is remarkable. Operation Crimson Dawn was just the beginning. You've got commendations I can't even discuss, citations for valor I can't acknowledge. So tell me, why did you let them treat you like that? Why didn't you defend yourself?" Maria met his gaze steadily. "Because respect that has to be demanded isn't real respect, sir. And because I wanted to see if anyone here would look past the uniform to see the soldier. I wanted to know if this place was worth fighting for." "And is it?" Maria thought about that for a long moment. "I'm not sure yet, sir." Hayes nodded, something like understanding crossing his face. "Fair enough," dismissed Captain. As Maria walked back to her barracks that evening, the sun setting behind the pine trees, she felt something shift. The battle wasn't over. She knew Morrison and the others wouldn't forgive her for making them look foolish. But the ground had changed beneath her feet. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer dismissed. She was finally being seen. And that, she thought, was both a victory and a new beginning. Word spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew about Captain Sullivan and the Silver Dagger patch. The whispers followed her through the commissary, across the parade grounds, into every building she entered. Some looks were respectful, even admiring. Others were resentful, suspicious, as if Maria had somehow cheated by hiding her credentials. Morrison avoided her completely, which was fine with Maria, but she noticed something else. The other officers in the Advanced Tactics program had split into two camps. Some began acknowledging her with nods, even asking questions during breaks. Others hardened their resistance, as if her revealed background somehow threatened their own worth. Colonel Hayes changed his approach as well. He called on her regularly now, using her experience to illustrate tactical concepts. During exercises, he often asked her to critique the other officers' decisions, which didn't win her any friends, but forced the class to take her seriously. 3 weeks after the simulation incident, Hayes announced a major evaluation, a 3-day field exercise that would test everything they'd learned. Teams would be assigned challenging objectives deep in the training grounds, 1,000 acres of dense forest and rough terrain. They would have limited supplies, no communication with base, and constant pressure from opposing forces, played by seasoned sergeants. "This exercise accounts for 40% of your program grade," Hayes said, his eyes moving across the assembled officers. "It will determine who continues and who washes out. Teams will be assigned randomly." The random assignments paired Maria with 3 officers who had remained neutral toward her Lieutenant Karen Phillips, an intelligence specialist in her late 30s, Captain David Chun, a logistics expert with a quiet demeanor, and Lieutenant Mark Daniels, young and eager but inexperienced. Not ideal, but not hostile. Maria could work with that. Morrison's team included 2 of his closest allies and an officer named Captain Raymond Cross, who had the distinction of being the only person in the class older than Maria. Cross was former infantry, decorated and respected, and he didn't suffer fools. Maria had seen him watching her with an evaluator's eye, measuring, judging, but never hostile. The exercise began at dawn on a Thursday. Each team received their objective in a sealed envelope, opened only after they'd been dropped at their starting points miles apart in the forest. Maria's team gathered around as she broke the seal. Primary objective: locate and secure the intelligence package hidden at Checkpoint Delta, she read aloud. Secondary objective: evade or neutralize opposing forces. Tertiary objective: extract to Rally Point Echo by Saturday 1700 hours. That's only 60 hours, Phillips said, studying the map. And Checkpoint Delta is at least 20 miles through rough country. We'll need to average 7 miles a day, Chine added. That's doable, but it doesn't leave much margin for error. Maria spread the map on the ground, and her team gathered around. The direct route takes us through 3 valleys and across 2 ridgelines. Classic ambush territory. We'll be picked off before we get halfway. So, what do you suggest? Daniels asked, his youth showing in his eagerness that Maria traced an alternative path with her finger. We go around. Adds distance but uses the terrain for concealment. There's a creek that runs parallel to our route. We can use it to mask our movement and replenish water. Phillips nodded slowly. It's smart, conservative, but it might take too long. Speed won't matter if we don't make it, Maria said. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. They moved out within the hour, Maria taking point. The forest was thick with underbrush, the ground uneven and treacherous. But Maria felt at home here in a way she hadn't since returning stateside. This environment, uncertain, demanding, unforgiving, was where she had learned to trust her instincts. By afternoon, they reached a creek. The water was cold and clear, running fast over smooth stones. They followed it northeast, moving carefully, maintaining noise discipline. Once, they heard voices in the distance, an opposing force patrol. Maria signaled for her team to take cover, and they melted into the landscape, motionless, barely breathing. The patrol passed within 50 yards and never saw them. That night, they made a cold camp, no fire, no light. They ate field rations and talked in whispers, sharing the watch in 2-hour shifts. During Maria's watch, Phillips came and sat beside her, both women staring into the darkness. Can I ask you something? Phillips said quietly. Go ahead. Why didn't you say anything? About Silver Dagger, about your background. You let them treat you terribly. Maria was quiet for a long moment. Because I wanted to see who had honor. Who would judge me for what I did rather than what I looked like. And I wanted to know if I could still do this, lead, teach, contribute, without the reputation. Without the patch speaking for me? And can you? Maria smiled in the darkness. I guess we'll find out. Friday brought rain, turning the forest floor into mud that sucked at their boots with every step. They pressed on, making slower progress, but staying on schedule. That afternoon, they encountered their first real challenge, a river too deep and fast to wade across. And the only bridge marked on their map was sure to be guarded. We could build a raft, Daniel suggested. Takes too long, Chun countered. And we'd be exposed on the water. Maria studied the river, her mind working through options. 50 yards upstream, a large tree had fallen, creating a natural bridge. It was precarious, wet from the rain, but passable. There, she said, pointing. We cross on the tree. One at a time, safety lines in case someone slips. It took an hour to rig the lines and make the crossing, but they all made it safely. On the far bank, they found fresh boot prints in the mud. A patrol had passed through recently, heading toward the marked bridge, just as Maria had predicted. Saturday morning, they reached Checkpoint Delta, a clearing marked by survey stakes and a cash box hidden in a hollow tree. Inside was the intelligence package, a set of encrypted documents, and a radio frequency. The secondary objective was complete. Now, they just had to get out. They were 2 hours into their extraction route when the ambush came. It started with a cracked training round that exploded in paint on a tree inches from Chun's head. Then chaos erupted as opposing forces opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow trail. Ambush, right? Maria shouted, already moving. She pulled Chun behind cover as rounds splattered around them. Phillips and Daniels hit the ground, scrambling for protection. Maria's combat instincts took over. She assessed the situation in seconds, 8 opponents, maybe 10, controlling the high ground. Her team was pinned down with limited cover and no good escape route. A textbook bad situation. Phillips, suppressing fire on that ridge. Chun, smoke grenade left side. Maria's commands came fast and clear. Daniels, with me. She didn't wait to see if they obeyed. She was already moving, using the smoke cover Chun deployed to flank the ambush position. Daniels followed, keeping pace, his earlier eagerness now focused into disciplined action. Maria circled behind the opposing force, coming up on their position from an unexpected angle. She took out 3 in quick succession with precisely aimed training rounds. The ambush collapsed as her team pressed forward, catching the opposing force in their own trap. When the exercise ended, both sides stood panting, marked with paint but grinning. The sergeant leading the opposing force, a weathered man with 25 years of service, nodded at Maria with genuine respect. "Best tactical response I've seen all week," he said. "You've done this before." "Once or twice," Maria replied. Her team made it to Rally Point Echo with 3 hours to spare. They were exhausted, mud-covered, and triumphant. As they waited for extraction, Phillips clasped Maria's shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing us how it's done." The transport arrived at dusk, and as they loaded up, Maria saw other teams arriving. Morrison's group was among them, looking tired but intact. Morrison caught her eye for just a moment, and Maria saw something there she hadn't seen before. Not respect, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding back at base. As they cleaned their gear and filed their reports, Maria felt something settle into place. She had proven herself not through words or reputation, but through action. Through leadership when it mattered. Through the quiet competence that had always defined her. Silver Dagger patch or not, Colonel Hayes found her that evening in the equipment room, stowing her field gear. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her work. "Your team performed exceptionally," he finally said. Phillips submitted her evaluation. She wants to request you as her commanding officer when she gets her next assignment. Maria looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Really." Hayes stepped into the room, his usual stern expression softening slightly. "You've changed this program, Sullivan, whether you realize it or not. Some of these officers will wash out because they can't adapt, can't see past their own prejudices. But the ones who make it through will be better leaders because of what you've taught them. I haven't taught them anything they couldn't learn from a book." "Sir, that's where you're wrong." Hayes met her eyes directly. "You've taught them something no book can convey, that leadership isn't about fitting a mold. It's about courage, competence, and character. And you've got all three in abundance." Maria felt something tighten in her chest, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not just validation, but hope. Hope that maybe she did belong here. Maybe she could make a difference. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. Hayes nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Sullivan. On Monday, we start the final phase of the program. Command evaluations. You'll be leading exercises, making tactical decisions that affect the entire class. It's going to get harder before it gets easier." "I understand, sir. I don't think you do." Hayes' expression grew serious. "Morrison filed a formal complaint yesterday. He's claiming your Silver Dagger background gives you an unfair advantage, that the program isn't equally challenging for you. He wants you removed from the class." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. After everything, Morrison still couldn't accept her presence. "What happens now?" "Now we see if the system works," Hayes said. "The complaint goes to the base commander for review. He'll make a decision within the week." After Hayes left, Maria sat alone in the equipment room, the smell of gun oil and canvas heavy in the air. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to still hurt this much, to still feel like she was fighting the same battle over and over. Outside, the sun was setting over Fort Braxton, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Maria watched through the window, thinking about all the sunsets she'd seen in faraway places, all the battles she'd fought and won. This was just one more fight. One more hill to take, and she wasn't done climbing yet. Monday morning arrived with the weight of uncertainty. Maria reported to the classroom as ordered, unsure if she'd be allowed to stay or sent packing with her career in ruins. The complaint Morrison filed hung over everything like a storm cloud, and whispers followed her through the building. Colonel Hayes stood at the podium, his expression unreadable as the officers filed in. Maria noticed that the seating arrangement had changed. The chairs now formed a semicircle rather than rows. creating a more collaborative atmosphere. Or perhaps an arena. Before we begin today's session, Hayes said once everyone was seated, I need to address a matter that affects this entire class. Captain Morrison has filed a formal complaint regarding Captain Sullivan's participation in this program. Morrison sat up straighter, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Several other officers shifted uncomfortably. The complaint alleges that Captain Sullivan's background creates an unfair advantage, Hayes continued. That her prior experience makes the program less challenging for her than for other officers, thereby compromising the integrity of the evaluation process. Maria kept her face still, but her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment when everything she'd worked for could crumble. Hayes pulled a folder from his desk. I've reviewed this complaint carefully. I've also reviewed Captain Sullivan's performance records, her evaluation scores, and feedback from the field exercise. He paused, his gaze moving around the room. Additionally, I've received a communication from the base commander that affects this matter. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. This program exists to identify and develop exceptional tactical leaders. Its purpose is not to create equal challenges, but to discover who rises to meet whatever challenges they face. His eyes locked on Morrison. Captain Morrison, your complaint suggests that having a highly skilled operator in the class somehow diminishes your own performance. I would argue the opposite. Captain Sullivan's presence raises the standard. She shows you what excellence looks like. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. However, Hayes continued, since this complaint has been filed, it requires official response. He held up the paper. This is a directive from Base Commander General Patrick Donovan. General Donovan has taken a personal interest in this matter. The room went completely silent. General Donovan was alleged a 3-star general who had risen through the ranks on merit and had a reputation for absolute integrity. If he was involved, this was more serious than anyone had realized. General Donovan has ordered a special evaluation, Hayes said. A demonstration exercise to be conducted this afternoon. The general himself will be present to observe. The exercise will test tactical leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to command respect from subordinate officers. Maria's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was public, high stakes, with her entire future on the line. Captain Morrison, Hayes said, as the officer who filed the complaint, you will lead the first team. Captain Sullivan will lead the second. You'll both be given the same tactical scenario and evaluated on your performance. The general will make his determination based on what he observes. Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly. Sir, I don't think. Your complaint questioned whether Captain Sullivan earned her place here. Hayes interrupted. Now you'll have the opportunity to prove your position. Or not. The morning session passed in a blur of tension. Maria could barely focus on the lecture, her mind already running through tactical possibilities, trying to prepare for an unknown scenario. Around her, the other officers whispered among themselves, speculation running wild about what the afternoon would bring. When they broke for lunch, Maria couldn't eat. She sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, staring at a tray of food she'd barely touched. Phillips approached and sat down across from her. You're going to be fine, Phillips said quietly. You've already proven yourself. Have I? Maria looked up. Or have I just given them another reason to find me lacking? Sullivan. Phillips leaned forward, her voice fierce. I've served with a lot of officers. Most of them were competent. Some were good. But you? You're exceptional. And whatever happens this afternoon, that doesn't change. Maria nodded, trying to draw strength from the words. But doubt gnawed at her. What if Morrison performed better? What if the general sided with the complaint? What if all of this, the struggle, the mockery, the battles won, still wasn't enough? At 1300 hours, the entire advanced tactics class assembled in the simulation warehouse. But they weren't alone. General Donovan stood near the observation area, surrounded by senior staff. He was in his early 60s, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. His uniform bore enough decorations to fill a museum, but he wore them without pretense, as if they were simply part of the fabric. Colonel Hayes called the class to attention, and everyone snapped into position. General Donovan returned the salute, then spoke in a voice that carried authority without needing volume. At ease. I'm here today because a question has been raised about merit, about standards, and about what it means to lead. His gaze swept across the assembled officers. These are not small questions. They go to the heart of who we are as a military and what we value as an institution. He gestured to the simulation area. Today's exercise is straightforward. Each team leader will be given the same scenario, a hostage rescue in an urban environment. High risk, multiple variables, no perfect solution. Each leader will have the same resources, the same time limit, the same constraints. What differs is how they command, how they adapt, and how they inspire their team to execute under pressure. Morrison was called first. His team assembled quickly, the officers who had always supported him, who believed in his leadership. They entered the simulation area, and the scenario began. Maria watched on the monitors as Morrison's team moved through the mock city. He was competent, she had to admit. His commands were clear, his positioning sound. He moved his team with confidence, keeping them coordinated as they approached the target building. But when they encountered the first obstacle, a locked door that required breaching, Morrison hesitated. The simulation threw variables at him, civilians in the line of fire, armed hostiles on multiple floors, a ticking clock as the hostage situation deteriorated. Maria could see him processing, trying to remember the textbook solutions. His team breached the building and began clearing rooms. They moved methodically, but slowly, their caution costing precious time. When they reached the hostages, they found one already killed in the simulation, a casualty of their delayed response. They secured the others and extracted, but the operation was messy, uncertain, marked by hesitation at critical moments. When Morrison's team emerged, he looked shaken. The confidence he'd carried into the exercise had been replaced by something harder to define, perhaps. The first real understanding of how difficult command truly was under pressure. General Donovan made notes on a tablet but said, "Nothing. Captain Sullivan," Hayes called. "Your team." Maria's heart raced as she assembled her team. Phillips, Chun, and Daniels stepped forward immediately, but Hayes shook his head. "Different team this time, Captain. You'll take Lieutenants Morrison, Jackson, and Foster." Maria's eyes widened. Morrison on her team? Two of his closest allies? It was a test within a test, not just of her tactical skill, but of her ability to lead officers who didn't want to follow her. Morrison's face went pale. "Sir, I just completed the exercise." You'll serve as second in command on Captain Sullivan's team," General Donovan said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Unless you believe you're incapable of following orders from a fellow officer?" Morrison swallowed hard. "No, sir." "Then take your position." The simulation reset. Maria gathered her reluctant team around her, aware of the eyes watching from the observation area, aware that everything, her career, her reputation, her future, depended on the next 30 minutes. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I know some of you don't want to be here. I know you doubt me. But right now, none of that matters. There are hostages in that building who are counting on us. So we're going to put aside our differences and do our jobs." "Understood?" Grudging nods. Morrison wouldn't meet her eyes. "Morrison," Maria said, forcing him to look at her. "I need you as my second. You know tactics, command structure. I need you to watch our six and keep the team coordinated. Can you do that?" For a long moment, Morrison said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Good. Here's how we're going to do this." Maria outlined her plan quickly and efficiently. Where Morrison had been cautious, she would be decisive. Where he had hesitated, she would act. But she also listened to input, adjusting her approach based on observations from her team. This wasn't about proving she was better. It was about proving she could lead. They entered the simulation, and Maria felt the familiar calm settle over her. This was what she had done in the real world, where mistakes cost lives and hesitation meant death. The simulation was just training, but her mind treated it the same way. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. They moved fast, using speed and surprise rather than slow caution. When they hit the locked door, Maria had already prepared the breach charge. They were through in seconds, flowing into the building like water, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency. The simulation threw complications at them, civilians panicking. Hostiles in unexpected positions, a structural collapse that blocked their primary route. Each time, Maria adapted instantly, her commands crisp and confident. And Morrison, despite his initial resistance, followed those commands without hesitation. "Hostile, second floor window." Jackson called. "Suppress and flank," Maria ordered. "Morrison, take Foster and circle left. I'll draw fire." On my mark. It was a risky maneuver, exposing herself to draw the enemy's attention while her team maneuvered into position. But it worked. The hostile engaged her, and Morrison's team eliminated the threat from the side. "Good work," Maria said as they regrouped. Morrison looked at her with something new in his eyes, not quite respect, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. They reached the hostages with minutes to spare. All alive, all secured. The extraction was smooth, professional, textbook perfect. As they exited the simulation area, Maria's team was breathing hard but intact. General Donovan stood waiting. The warehouse was silent, except for the sound of boots on concrete as Maria's team assembled before him. "At ease," the general said. He looked at Morrison first. "Lieutenant Morrison, your assessment of Captain Sullivan's leadership?" Morrison stiffened, clearly not expecting to be put on the spot. His jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. She led with confidence, sir. Made quick decisions. Trusted her team to execute. And did you trust her commands?" Morrison hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Once the exercise began, I followed her lead. Why? Because she knew what she was doing, sir. And because lives depended on it, even if they were just simulated." General Donovan turned to Maria. "Captain Sullivan, tell me about your team's performance." Maria chose her words carefully. "They performed exceptionally, sir. Lieutenant Morrison provided solid tactical support and kept the team coordinated. His input during the planning phase helped refine our approach. It was generous, perhaps more than Morrison deserved. But Maria understood something that Morrison was just beginning to learn, that leadership wasn't about diminishing others to elevate yourself. It was about bringing out the best in everyone under your command." General Donovan nodded slowly, then addressed the entire class. "I came here today because a complaint was filed suggesting that exceptional skill somehow compromises the integrity of this program. Having observed both exercises, I can tell you that nothing could be further from the truth." He paused, letting his words sink in. Captain Morrison led his team competently. His tactics were sound, his approach reasonable. Under normal circumstances, his performance would be entirely acceptable. Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly, hearing the implicit criticism in the praise. "Captain Sullivan, the general continued, led with the kind of decisiveness and clarity that saves lives in actual combat. She adapted to changing circumstances, trusted her team's abilities, and most importantly, she demonstrated that leadership transcends personal feelings. She made Lieutenant Morrison, an officer who has publicly questioned her right to be here, into an effective member of her team. That is exceptional leadership. The general's gaze swept across the room. The complaint filed against Captain Sullivan suggests that her prior experience gives her an unfair advantage. Let me be clear. There is no such thing as an unfair advantage when that advantage comes from service, sacrifice, and proven capability. Captain Sullivan earned her Silver Dagger patch through operations most of you will never know about, in conditions most of you cannot imagine. That doesn't disqualify her from this program. It makes her exactly the kind of officer we need training our next generation of leaders. Morrison stood rigid, his face flushed. However, General Donovan said, his voice hardening, I am troubled by something else. I'm troubled that a highly decorated officer was allowed to face months of disrespect, mockery, and deliberate obstruction. I'm troubled that some officers in this program valued their own egos over the opportunity to learn from someone with genuine expertise. He looked directly at Morrison. Lieutenant Morrison, you filed a complaint about standards. Let me tell you about standards. The standard is excellence. The standard is honor. The standard is putting mission and team above personal pride. By those standards, you have failed. The words landed like hammer blows. Morrison's face went white. You will issue a formal apology to Captain Sullivan, the general continued. You will acknowledge that your complaint was without merit and motivated by personal bias. And you will spend the remainder of this program learning what real leadership looks like, or you will wash out. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. General Donovan turned to Colonel Hayes. Colonel, I'm recommending Captain Sullivan for immediate promotion to Major, an assignment as an instructor in this program. She's proven she can lead, teach, and maintain standards under the most challenging circumstances. We need that expertise institutionalized. Maria felt the room tilt slightly. Major? Instructor? It was more than she had hoped for, more than she had dared to imagine. Furthermore, the general said, I'm directing that Captain Sullivan's Silver Dagger service be properly acknowledged. She and officers like her represent the highest standards of our military. They should be celebrated, not hidden. They should be teaching, not fighting for basic respect. He approached Maria directly, and she snapped to attention. The general extended his hand, and she shook it, feeling the strength and certainty in his grip. Thank you for your service, Major Sullivan, he said quietly. And thank you for not giving up on us, even when we failed to see your worth. Tears pricked at Maria's eyes, but she blinked them back. It's my honor to serve, sir. The general nodded, then addressed the class one final time. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Leadership isn't about conforming to expectations or fitting into comfortable categories. It's about rising to meet challenges, regardless of who delivers them or where they come from. Some of you will learn that lesson. Others won't. That's what this program is designed to reveal. He turned and left, his staff following. The warehouse remained silent for a long moment after his departure. Then Colonel Hayes spoke, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. You heard the general. Major Sullivan will be joining the instructional staff. Those of you who remain in this program will have the opportunity to learn from her directly. I suggest you don't waste it. The class was dismissed. As officers filed out, several approached Maria with handshakes and congratulations. Phillips hugged her outright. Chun gave her a crisp salute and a genuine smile. Morrison approached last. He stood before her, shoulders squared but eyes downcast. Major Sullivan, I need to apologize. Not here, Maria said quietly. And not because you were ordered to. When you're ready to apologize because you understand why you were wrong, come find me. Until then, focus on learning how to be a better officer. Morrison looked up, surprised. Then he nodded and walked away, something shifting in his expression that might have been the first stirring of actual respect. Maria left the warehouse and walked across the base as the sun began its descent. Fort Braxton looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She had come here battered, uncertain, fighting for a place that seemed determined to reject her. Now she was staying not as a student, but as a teacher. Not as an outsider, but as someone who had earned her place through every difficult step. She thought about the photograph on her desk, her team, her fallen friends, the operations that had shaped her. They had given everything so that others could live freely, could serve with honor, could stand on ground they had helped secure. Now it was Maria's turn to carry that forward, to teach the next generation, to show them that leadership came in many forms, that strength could look different than they expected, and that the best officers were those who never stopped learning, never stopped adapting, never stopped fighting for what was right. As she reached her quarters, no longer a barracks room, but officer housing befitting her new rank, Maria paused. The silver dagger patch on her shoulder caught the fading sunlight, the silver thread glinting like a promise. She had been tested. She had been doubted. She had been forced to prove herself again and again. But she had never broken. And now, finally, she had found her place not just in the military, but in shaping its future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be officers resistant to learning from her, policies that needed changing, systems that moved slowly. But Maria had faced worse odds in darker places. She smiled, unlocked her door, and stepped inside. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle played taps, the notes drifting across the base like a benediction. The day was ending, but Maria's real mission was just beginning. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The end.